Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our complimentary webinar series for U.S. federal government contractors. We are coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. You probably found out about today's webinar through our newsletter, which reaches over 23,000 federal government contractors and service providers. Today's session is complimentary and also recorded. You can find the recording on our website and YouTube channel about 24 hours after the webinar. We have over 525 complimentary webinars on our YouTube channel. This includes all 52 parts of the FAR and all 52 parts of the DFARS and hundreds of webinars on strategic and tactical topics. If you would like to advertise in our newsletter or in any upcoming webinars, please email at hello@jenniferschaus.com. A little bit about us. We are a specialized consulting firm focused on working with established federal contractors. We work with product, service, and software firms across the globe. For more information about our services, please visit our website and select About Us. As mentioned, today's webinar is covering the FAR supplement. It is complimentary and also recorded. We began this series in January 2022, and you can find these past recordings on our website as well as future schedule and registration links. As you can see here, we have covered several of these FAR supplements already, and we'll wind down the series on August 24th with the Veterans Administration. Then on Fridays, we cover the same agency or department in a Playbook series. The Friday webinars discuss upcoming bidding opportunities, contracting trends, small business resources, and sometimes feature a government speaker. The full schedule and past recordings are on our website under the Playbook tab. Please join us at the Kennedy Center for a night of networking with over 200 federal contractors. Our quarterly event will take place on Monday, June 20th. Sponsorship opportunities are available. Federal agencies will be present and will be listed as they confirm. Please note that ticket prices increase on June 13th. We hope to see you there. Now we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsors who make the webinar series possible. We would like to thank the Virginia Ptac. The Virginia Ptac is based out of GMU in Fairfax and offers free one-on-one counseling to firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. If you are interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore what Ptacs can offer. And a special thanks to the Federal Business Council. The FBC creates and manages virtual and in-person meetings and events to connect appropriate industry and government thought leaders, product providers, and solutions with government programs that use them. The FBC works within mission-specific programs for a variety of agencies to connect government and industry in the form of in-person and virtual conferences, training events, policy dialogue, and outreach. Over the last 40+ years, FBC has become a comprehensive resource for connecting industry and federal government. DASN is an IT and cloud solutions provider working with corporations, the military, and government agencies to lower their costs, increase scalability, improve operational efficiency, and meet compliance regulations using targeted cloud-based solutions. DASN is a certified partner of Oracle NetSuite, a premier tier Google Cloud partner, and a certified partner of Cisco, VirtuDocs, AODocs, and Authenticate. For more information about DASN services or to schedule a complimentary consultation, please email Joe Alston. His contact information is on the lower left corner of your slide. You can also visit the DASN website. Thank you again to the attendees and our speaker for joining us today in our FAR Supplement series. We are here today to dig into the FAR Supplement on the Department of Treasury. Our speaker today is Bob Tompkins. He represents the firm Holland and Knight. As a reminder, we do not take questions, so if you have questions for Bob, his contact information will be displayed at the end of the presentation, and you can contact him directly. Thank you, Bob, for joining us today. I'll put myself on mute and wait for your cue for the next slide. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Krista, and thank you and your colleagues and Jennifer for allowing us to participate in your series. As you've mentioned, we're going to be addressing the Department of Treasury FAR supplement today. And so with that, I think we can move on to the next slide. So very briefly, we're going to, here's a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. We'll talk a bit very briefly about the role of the FAR supplements and how they relate to the FAR. Then we'll address some specific DTARs, as they're known, of note, and talk about, at least broadly, what some of the other agency procurement regulations or applicable regulations might be. And then we'll have just a couple of slides to discuss the agency and its overall spending and where the spending tends to come from, both in terms of the specific bureaus within the Department of Treasury, but also looking at NAICS codes and things of that sort that might give you some indication of what sorts of things the agency or its bureaus are buying. So with that, we can move on to the next slide. So what is the FAR? What are the FAR supplements? How do they relate to the FAR itself? Of course, the FAR is the Federal Acquisition Regulation. It's found in Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It is, for most federal agencies, the FAR is the applicable set of regulations that govern the procurement of goods and services. So that makes it distinct from grants and assistance agreements that are covered by other regulations, including those found in Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations. So the FAR tends to govern, in most cases, when federal agencies are buying goods or services for their own benefit and use. And so the FAR itself, the base set of the FAR documents are applied generally across the board to each agency. Each agency may adopt FAR supplements to further implement the provisions of the FAR or to supplement what is already in the FAR to meet their particular needs. In the case of the Treasury Department, their FAR supplement, the DTAR, is found in Title 48, Chapter 10. One thing of note, the Treasury Department has a number of different bureaus, and we'll discuss those later in the presentation. The FAR and the DTAR applies to the procurement practices of each of them except for the U.S. Mint. So keep in mind that the FAR and the DTAR do not apply to the U.S. Mint. There are a few agencies like the Mint which are subject to a different set of procurement rules, the Federal Aviation Administration being one of note, which has its own acquisition management system and therefore is not subject to the FAR. But the remaining bureaus within Treasury and Treasury itself follow the FAR when they're conducting procurement, and they've adopted a fairly brief FAR supplement that we'll talk about today. And you'll see a common theme when we go through some of the key provisions of the DTAR. You'll note that most, if not all of them, have some special nexus to Treasury's overall mission. And so you'll see that common pattern. Beyond the FAR and the FAR supplement, there are, in many cases, other regulations or other requirements, legal requirements that may apply to specific types of procurements, procurements from certain agencies. And so it's important to always check your solicitations, your RFPs, and focus not only on the FAR clauses they provide, but typically in a FAR Part 15 procurement, for example, Section H of the solicitation will contain special clauses. And so you always want to make sure you pay special attention to those Section H clauses, because they may impose requirements that go above and beyond or that are different from those found in the FAR and FAR supplements. And then, of course, it's also important to note that contractors may be subject to other regulations that are not procurement specific necessarily. And within the context of the Treasury Department, we'll talk about this later on in terms of some of their particular buying habits. There are potentially other applicable regulatory regimes that might apply to contractors. So, for example, the IRS engages contractors to assist it with the collection of tax debts. And so those debt collection agency contracts will not only be subject potentially to the FAR and the DTAR, but they may also, and likely will, contain other regulatory requirements, including those related to fair debt collection practices and the like. Likewise, because much of what the Treasury Department is doing might deal with individuals, including individual taxpayers, you also have to be mindful of personally identifiable information issues which again may not be specifically addressed by the FAR or the DTAR, but may be governed by other regulations which will work their way either explicitly or implicitly into the contract. So a number of different regulatory regimes may come into play. We're going to focus today on the FAR and in particular the DTAR. And with that, we can move on to the next slide. So let's jump right in and talk about some of the key DTAR provisions and why they're important. So the first one, the first set, or the first couple rather, will spill out of Part 9. And again, the FAR supplements generally correspond in their numerology to the overall parts of the FAR itself. And so FAR Part 9, among other things, deals with contractor eligibility in business practices. And so here, the Treasury Department has identified two special issues that are addressed in the DTAR. The first of these is the no publicity provision, which is accompanied by a DTAR clause that basically states that there are significant limitations on the way contractors can publicize their work with the agency. And so important to note that you need to be mindful of this. Say you win an award, you need to be cognizant of this requirement before you issue any press release. You certainly can't do anything that would suggest that your company, your contractor, has been endorsed by the Treasury Department by virtue of your selection as a contractor or otherwise. And so, again, very important clause to keep in mind, and somewhat atypical from what you might find with other agencies and other types of contracts. The second provision in Part 9 relates to enhanced tax check requirements. And of course, the Treasury Department includes, among other things, the Internal Revenue Service, which is charged with the collection of taxes. And so, not surprisingly, the Treasury Department, when it engages contractors, wants to make especially sure that the contractors it engages are up to date on their taxes. And so there are basic requirements in FAR Part 9 that require certifications that there are not outstanding tax liabilities, but Treasury takes it a step further, and in some ways what they're doing is arguably redundant to what's in the main part of the FAR. But of course, Treasury wants to make it very clear to the world that they take tax payments and tax compliance very seriously, and so they've explicitly included an enhanced tax check requirement for their contractors. So be aware of that. And there are potentially some added checks that might apply to principals within a contractor as well that Treasury is very keen on for all the reasons we've described. So those are two key provisions, really the two substantive provisions in the DTAR Part 9, and important ones to be mindful of as a potential or actual Treasury contractor. Moving on to the next slide, we'll be moving on to Part 19, which you'll know from the FAR is the part that governs small business and related SBA preference programs. Two things to note here with respect to Treasury. First of all, Treasury has its own mentor protege program. This is separate and apart from the SBA's mentor protege program. Other agencies like Treasury have their own mentor protege programs, DOD and others. SBA is the primary mentor protege program, but again, Treasury has its own. There's been some back and forth over the years as to whether SBA will recognize and give effect to mentor protege programs of other agencies, and they've come to terms with a process whereby SBA will enter into a form of agreement with the agency that wishes to establish its own mentor protege program, and they've done so with Treasury. So it's a separate program from the SBA program. And applications are processed through the Treasury's OSDBU office. And so there are specific eligibility criteria and expectations from the mentor and the protege that are spelled out in the OSDBU's, on the OSDBU's website, and which will govern the application process and the conduct of the parties if they should be approved in a mentor protege relationship. So be mindful, there's a separate program there. It's not the same as the SBA program. And it's governed by the OSDBU office at Treasury. The second aspect of Part 19 rather is that Treasury does have sort of an amplified requirement for ensuring participation by minority and women businesses in contracts that exceed $150,000, and the DTAR prescribes a clause that would go into any contract in excess of that value that requires, quote, good faith efforts on the part of the contractor to use minority and women-owned businesses. And so here again, they're amplifying, supplementing, if you will, the other aspects of the FAR, which prescribe in a broad sense similar requirements, whether it be through subcontracting plans or otherwise. So another special add-on from Treasury in the context of minority and women-owned small businesses. Moving on to the next slide, please. So contract financing, FAR Part 32, as you can certainly imagine, issues of financing and funding are keen areas of interest for the Department of Treasury. And so they have a couple of different provisions here that are important to note, and again, are not necessarily at odds with, and by definition are really supplementing the primary obligations that are set forth in the FAR. Treasury has an explicit recognition of the impact of continuing resolutions that might be passed by Congress in order to provide interim funding to the government while broader appropriations bills are debated and hopefully passed. And we all know that certainly in the past number of years, the reliance on CRs, as they're called, has become, unfortunately, somewhat commonplace. And so the Treasury Department addresses the impact of CRs in its regulations and has some, consistent with the broad principles of federal appropriations law, has included some provisions in the DTAR that basically speak to the fact that, absent a appropriation, including through the context of, in the context of a CR, they place limits on the incremental funding of contracts and mandate, consistent with appropriation law, that funds have to be appropriated to Treasury or the Bureau of the Treasury Department in order for those to be passed through to the contractor. This all feeds into the broader issues of federal appropriations law and the Anti-Deficiency Act and so on, and particularly because Treasury has a stewardship role for the public fisc. They're particularly attuned to the importance of federal appropriations law. The second issue, which is not necessarily all that different from what you might find in other areas of the government and other agencies, is that the Treasury Department generally requires the use of electronic submission of payment requests, and that's fairly ubiquitous now, but it's explicitly listed in the DTARs in FAR Part 32. Moving on to the next slide here. FAR Part 34, it's just worth noting that for major acquisitions that Treasury gives some special attention. Again, this is not necessarily unique for Treasury, and they provide some definitions of what might constitute major acquisitions. This particular part of the DTAR is not terribly lengthy, but I've included a couple of the key provisions, or definitions rather, that describe what Treasury is focused on with these major IT investments. And so be mindful that if you're playing in that space, that there may be some special rules, approvals, planning, et cetera, that have to happen within the agency. And among other things, this might influence how you as a contractor go about not only identifying the opportunities, but understanding that these requirements play into a number of different facets of the procurement process, including, for example, the market research activity, at least implicitly, that the Treasury Department or its bureaus will conduct. And so it's worth noting, if you are pursuing one of these major IT major acquisitions, that there are some special internal processes within the Treasury Department that will be used, and it's useful for you as a potential vendor to know what those are and understand how you might be able to further participate in the crafting of such requirements. So with that, those are really the few things of substance in the DTAR, and it's compared to other FAR supplements, it's relatively short, certainly in comparison to the Department of Defense, for example, the DFARs in Chapter 2 of Title 48. So we've really touched on really the key substantive provisions of the DTAR. And so given that it's rather brief, I thought it would be useful to spend the last few minutes of our program here talking about the agency itself and broadly speaking as to how it's structured, what they buy, and the NAICS codes in which they operate. So moving on to the next slide, you'll see that there are 11 different bureaus within within the agency that are listed here and are listed in the DTAR itself. As noted previously, one of those bureaus, the United States Mint, is not covered by the DTAR, so be mindful of that if you're engaged in a business fashion with the U.S. Mint. And so the other 11, though, are, the other 10 of the 11 are all subject to the FAR and the DTAR when they engage in procurement. So within these, I think we've got a slide coming up here next. Yeah, we can go ahead and move on to the next one. And this is just a snapshot from the procurement forecast and procurement data that's maintained on the Treasury OSDBU website to give you some indication of the volume of contracting that goes through the various bureaus. And you'll see in some cases it's nil or virtually nil. And so, you know, Bureau of Engraving and Printing is a reasonably substantial one. The CDFI program, next to nothing happening on the procurement front. It's not necessarily inconsistent with the way they operate and their overall operating profile and portfolio. But you'll see that the IRS is really the big player in the mix. Office of Comptroller of the Currency has some operations, procurement operations as well, BEP, DO as mentioned before. But IRS is really the big one, both in terms of the dollar value, the total number of awards, the existing awards, and so on that are out there. And there are quite a lot of other slices of data that are available on the Treasury OSDBU website that might give you further information about the agency and the bureaus and their buying habits. But this is a high-level summary that I think gives a flavor for where the action is, if you will. And comparatively speaking, you know, 162 million in option values, et cetera, awarded values of 136 million for the IRS is not insignificant, but in the broader scheme of the overall procurement market, you can see that Treasury is not a major acquirer of contractor goods and services, but they do acquire some very important things. Moving on to our next slide. Listed from that same data source, the top 10 existing NAICS codes across the board with the Treasury Department. And you'll see leading the pack in terms of number of awards is just 541, 519, other computer-related services. So you see a lot of the 541 notations in here, and then a few others scattered about that are indicative of the types of things that the Treasury Department and its bureaus acquire. One of the major things, as noted previously, that the IRS does acquire are debt collection, debt servicing services from private collection agencies. Historically and traditionally, the IRS has used the GSA Federal Supply Schedule program to acquire such services. And so, like other agencies, the Treasury Department and its bureaus have the FSS program available to them, as well as other government-wide acquisition contracts, GWACs, that they can utilize, and they do. And so a good chunk of the IRS's actual procurement activity happens to be done and procured through the GSA Federal Supply Schedule program. And the debt collection issues, as I noted before, is one of those where beyond the FAR and the DTAR requirements, companies that participate in that particular industry are subject to a host of other borrower and consumer protection laws, for example, that will affect how they operate. And those provisions may find their way into the contracts themselves, and in particular may be found in Section H or elsewhere of those contracts. So going back to the early phases of our presentation here today, it's always important to read your RFP, to read your contract, not only take stock of the FAR and DTAR clauses that are incorporated either in their entirety or by reference, but also be mindful of other regulatory requirements that may be set out in the RFP/contract, including those in Section H. And then even if they're not, you may want to be certain that you're cognizant of what those other federal and in some cases state laws might be that are triggered by the nature of the activity that you're engaged in. With regard to that particular issue, there is oftentimes some tension between what federal and state law require, and the debt collection arena is one of those issues in particular, where federal agencies, including Treasury and also the Department of Education, which have a charge to engage contractors to collect debts or which collect debts on their own are potentially subject to both federal and state consumer protection type laws. And there can be some subtle but important differences between those regulatory regimes, and there are often battles that play out. So contractors should be aware of those general provisions. So with that, that brings us to the conclusion of our discussion today. There, again, is not very much of substance in the DTARs, but there are a few important things to note, which we have covered here, and I appreciate everyone's attendance and time. And as stated before, if there are follow-up questions about the presentation today, happy to field those. My contact information is provided here on the screen. But thank you again to Krista and the rest of the crowd at Jennifer Schaus and Associates for having us participate today, and we appreciate your listening in. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bob, for a great presentation. Thank you to all who participated. The recordings and slides will be available about 24 hours or less. Just once again, please join us at the Kennedy Center for a night of networking with over 200 federal contractors. Our quarterly event will take place on Monday, June 20th. Sponsorship opportunities are available. Federal agencies will be present and will be listed as they confirm. Please note that ticket prices increase on June 13th. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much, everyone.